Hello, Tabernacle family. What a joy it is to be with you again on another midweek video. I know we took a little pause with Easter last week and Good Friday, and thank you so much for either tuning in remotely or attending in person. Really, all the week of Easter festivities that we had, and lots of people doing lots of things behind the scenes, and you all know who you are. A real big thanks for that, and especially those who stepped up there for the nursery service there on Good Friday, and that allowed some of our younger families to come too. So big thanks all around for that. Really a matter of prayer as well. We tend to pray forward to things, but not backward about things. And what I mean is that we prayed for a good number of weeks that God would bless, that He'd bring out a number of people, and He did. He answered that prayer. Praise God. And so pray as well for the follow-up, for those who maybe had come back to church, who had not been here for a good long time. There were a number of those, praise God. And for those who came out for a first time, a number of those. Praise the Lord on all those occasions. And so just continue in prayer for the follow-up for those things, and just that the good Lord would make much of His name through all that process. As far as announcements, we've got a business meeting coming up. We've announced that a couple of times. So that's next Wednesday, the 14th. That'll be at 8 o'clock, probably a little bit closer to 8:10 the way these things work, and that's okay too. So please tune in. It'll be remote or attend in person, and that'll be your choice for that. So if you haven't gone there yet, we're in Ecclesiastes, of course, and we're in chapter 8. And so we are making our way through the second half of this book. Beautiful book of Ecclesiastes. So with that being said, I'm going to read the first 9 verses, and it's all about wisdom. We could use a lot of wisdom. And in particular, this is a wisdom that has the high office in mind. So how do you act in a very specific application when you're in the presence of the king? You may not have the chance to act in the presence of any given earthly king. I probably won't either. And so I think we could reasonably make some inferences. How do you act in the presence of your superiors, or how do you interact with government? Things along those lines. And those are quite practical on how we apply those things. So hopefully that gives you enough time to turn to Ecclesiastes 8. And I'll read the first 9 verses and then we'll get into it. Who is like the wise? Who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go out from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the words of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and way for everything, although a man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has the power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Really, all 9 verses flow pretty smoothly, organically, nearly seamlessly. If we were to discern a structure herein, I think verse 1 is something of an opening salvo. Verses 2 through 6 kind of have that idea about how to act in the presence of the king, and then this is what wisdom looks like in the presence of a king. But then 7 through 9 is a bit of a cautionary tale, where you sort of balance this out, namely that there are limitations to this wisdom, and so you don't have it in an ultimate sense, and you kind of want to be honest about those things. So that being said, verse 1, this opening salvo, this proverb, who is like the wise? Who knows the interpretation of the thing? It's been a couple of weeks since we've been here. I want you to hear what he's just said a few verses earlier in chapter 7. So go back to chapter 7, verse 23. He says this, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise. but it was far from me. That which has been is far off, very deep. Who can find it? Essentially, and this is something that he said a number of times, you set your heart to be wise, good for you, but understand that you're not wise like God. Understand that there is a limit to this wisdom. But now he kind of doubles back. He's very balanced in all of this. He's not so naive as to suppose that you really do know all things. But then you really can know something. And people run to these extremes far too often. People actually level that accusation against the Bible. They say, well, since you can't know God exhaustively, you can't know him truly. Well, I cry foul. Obviously, I can't know God exhaustively. He is infinite, I am not. There's a creator-creature distinction, but I can't know him truly. Same thing can be said when it comes to wisdom. Yes, Kohelet has just said there's a limit to all these things. However, who's like the wise? Well, this reminds us maybe there is actually a wise man. And in the latter part of this verse, he'll say, here's some things that a wise man can do. And so he's calling us back to something that's good. Maybe it's not an ultimate good, but it is a relative good. It is a real and true good that you and I would be wise. Well, that accords very much with what you read throughout Proverbs, throughout Psalms, obviously throughout Ecclesiastes here as well. So who's this wise man? So look around, see if you can find a wise person and emulate them. Who knows the interpretation of this thing? In other words, who knows, okay, something has happened. Now, interpret that which has happened. It's a little bit like as you read in the Old Testament that these people understood the times, or how Jesus says, you know the signs of the times. It's a little bit like you read the morning news and you're like, I kind of see not just this snippet, but how this snippet fits into the grand puzzle of this year or this decade or this century. It's a little bit different. Who knows how to interpret these things? It calls to my mind someone like Daniel who understood how to interpret a dream. And even more than that, understood what things were like in the midst of a very hard governance, be it Babylon or Persia. Well, who is like the wise? Who knows the interpretation of a thing? Well, having this wise man in sight, here's some things that would define or maybe illustrate or examples of wise living. A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. Some commentators kind of bicker back and forth at this point. Define his. Is that talking about the wise man or is it talking about the king? Because verses 2 through 6 and really beyond, there's a lot that's being said about the king. And so their thought would be this would be a proverb to be used by the courtiers. And as you're in the court, if you are wise, then your wisdom will actually affect the king. Well, there's something to be said for that. Good men differ on these things. I tend to try to just see this in normal grammatical expression. What I mean is when you come across a pronoun, it tends not to introduce someone as much as it does hearken back to the person which was already introduced. So we've just introduced the wise man. That's the antecedent. So the pronoun's going to look back. Here's what I mean. If you are a wise person, then in your wisdom, it makes your face to shine. Namely, that the natural fruit of wise living affects your countenance, that there will be a joy or a serenity or a peace, all these various virtues that accord with wisdom, and that's apparent on your face. Furthermore, the hardness of his face is changed. Well, what do you mean? That it's happy, happy, joy, joy all the time? Well, maybe not, right? Because sometimes in the course of your wisdom, you truly and sincerely look at some of the scars of this sin-cursed world. Well, your countenance would reflect that too. It would register that. And yet, even here, the hardness of that countenance can be changed. Kind of these sort of proverbs come to mind where the fool gives full vent to his vexation, whereas the wise man kind of keeps a rein on his spirit. That you don't have to allow everything that you come across to just color your expression and countenance and words and reactions. Rather than being a reactionary, you are a disciplined person. The normal countenance is that of peace, joy, and the virtues. However, even in the troubled times, you still have a self-control about you. That's wisdom. That's countenance. With that opening salvo and with that kind of context in mind, how do you act in the presence of a king? Or we could maybe say it this way: how do you act, employee, in the presence of your employer? Or how do you act, citizen, in the presence of your government, with whom you may or may not agree at times? So we come to verse 2. It says this: I say, here's just wisdom from Kohelet, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. At first, when you read this, the language is obscure enough that you think, wait. So God made an oath to the king, and because of God's oath to the king, I should act in a certain way. That's perhaps not quite right. So this is the oath of God. And you have taken this oath, to the king, to him, to the king, and you've taken this in the presence of God. So this is God's oath. So this is kind of like you as a courtier have been sworn into office, something along these lines, that you've made an oath. Raise your right hand. I do solemnly swear to execute the duties, etc. Well, remember you took an oath, and therefore that you would be honorable, that you would be a person of integrity. Well, that has real application, doesn't it? So here you are, an employee, and you probably signed some sort of code, employee handbook. You said, I'm not going to come to work drunk, and I'm not going to do whatever else that your code specifies. I'm not going to come to work having smoked weed, although now in New York, that'll be a great thing to do at work, and you can pay government tax on it. I'm sorry, I digress. Keep the king's command because of the oath. Be a person of integrity, right? Next verse. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Okay, pause. It's not always easy, is it? And so when the going gets tough, sometimes people are wanting to say, well, I'm out of here. But if you're out of there, then you lose the opportunity to exert any meaningful influence. So you have influence over people. There is leadership from above and there's leadership from below, and both are essential. And sometimes the king is surrounding himself with advisors because he needs advice. And the people at work need your input too. And this runs in all various hierarchical structures, right? That you have people who need advice from those around them. So don't be so hasty just to run away. It's kind of this idea of, as a kid, you just took your ball and went home. The problem is we don't grow out of that juvenile tendency. And so now things are hard. I'm leaving. Don't be hasty to do that. There may come a time to do that. There is a time to leave the presence of the king. There's a time to leave the work. There's a time to leave the church. There's a time to leave the country. Don't be so hasty to do it. Just wait for a minute. Because when you leave, you also lose that influence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he, the king, does whatever he pleases. There's a little common sense in this, namely, if there is an evil way, the righteous person ought not go that way in the first place. But there's also a sense of this evil cause being identified with a rebellion against the king, a coup d'etat, something like this, where you would say, don't do this. Remember, the king actually has power. He does whatever he pleases. And so be careful, you're going to run afoul of that. Don't do things that are going to put you in harm's way, right? He continues, for the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? It's kind of humorous. You almost have this idea, somebody going up to Nebuchadnezzar and you're just like, hey, Nebi, really bad idea. What are you thinking? Well, okay, well, you just died and your house was pulled down and maybe everyone was impaled. Like, that's really not the way to do it, right? So maybe we can take that even in our remarkably egalitarian society. Well, yes, that's all well and good, but a word fitly spoken is well placed. You don't just come and speak crassly. Rather, you'd have an honorable dialogue. Sometimes it may not even be the time to say anything at all, right? It's not just what you say, it's how you say it, it's when you say it. We can apply this in marriage, can't we? Either spouse. There's a proper time for these things. You don't just come up, hey, what are you doing? That may not elicit the best response that you're hoping for, right? So don't do it to the king, and maybe just don't do it in general. Obviously, it's okay to ask a question, but there's a time and place for all those things. We'll talk about time and place a little bit more in a moment. Verse 5, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. The idea is not that you are ignorant of any evil which is in the world. This evil thing, I want you to think of it like calamity or like the results, the disastrous results of poor choices that you make. So whoever's keeping the command is avoiding the consequences of doing evil. The thought really is kind of a theme and variation. We've kind of gone through this a lot. Namely this, the king really wields power, doesn't he? So don't be a fool. Don't put yourself in harm's way. That's not an absolute statement. And the full counsel of Scripture helps us understand that. I had mentioned Daniel earlier. Daniel is a great example of how to live righteously in the presence of unrighteousness and underneath an unrighteous regime that may in fact still be being used by God. So how do you do all of this? Well, there is a time to take a stand. And so Daniel knew something of the evil way, namely of this calamity, this bad fruit that came from not keeping the king's command. Sometimes you have Daniel's three friends bow the knee and they say no. Well, then they did end up knowing an evil thing, didn't they? So this is proverbial and not absolute. And you probably are getting familiar with this way of writing in Ecclesiastes by this time. It's just wisdom literature right here. But the general rule is obey the king, keep the command, and you're not going to put yourself in harm's way. Continuing through verse 5. The wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. Excellent. That is a wonderful description of wisdom. Timing matters and custom matters. The just way would be kind of the normal way of doing things, the culturally appropriate way of doing things. And when the culture is right, this would be considered righteous, just. Be wise in this sense. However, let's balance that out. There's, verse 6, a time and a way for everything. Doesn't chapter 3 come to mind? A time to die, a time to be born, all of that. There's a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. You might be vexed, you might be troubled, life might be very hard, and yet there's still a wise way to live. Don't cast wisdom off. Wisdom is a faithful friend. In fact, it's more valuable than riches, it's more valuable than many things. And this text just shows how that works even in the presence of high power. Nonetheless, there's a limitation to this wisdom. And again, verse 7 through 9, it flows very smoothly, but I'll take a little break and a little turn, and you'll notice that it starts to sound a little bit different now. Verse 7 sounds like this. For he does not know who? This wise person. We've just been enjoined to look for the wise person. Where is he? Well, we found one. But he, this wise person, does not know what is to be. For who can tell him how it will be? It's a rhetorical question. We know the answer. Nobody ultimately knows. You have this very, very wise person, and sometimes they get it wrong. You look at how governments operate, and sometimes you stand back and you're like, what are you thinking? And the answer is, look, if you were there, maybe you wouldn't do much better. Because when it comes to the matters of world governance and national governance, it's awfully complicated. You may not govern your home very well, right? You may not govern your own personal life very well because you know life is very complicated. You don't know what will be. Verse 8. Here's a bunch of things you can't do. 4 of them. First of all, no man has power to retain his spirit. Now that word spirit, it might be wind. Either way, the point remains. Can you restrain the wind? Well, let's go out and grasp the wind. Can you do that? No. Or can you retain your spirit? In other words, if it's spirit, then you would take this in conjunction with the next phrase. Can you actually keep your spirit from leaving you when your number comes up? You have no power over this. Next phrase. Or power over the day of death. So again, either this is 2 separate things or it's just a compatible phraseology. You can't control when you're going to die. You can't say, well, you know what? Maybe I'd prefer Thursday over Wednesday. Good grief. Sometimes you talk to people who've attempted suicide and they don't get it. I mean, you have such little influence over the day of your death. Sometimes trying to avoid it, you end up running to it. You understand that God is the one who deals that out. You don't have that power. There's no discharge from war. And again, if you're going to be technical, you can find a way in which a person can be discharged from military service. That's before the battle begins. I'm thinking of Leviticus, things like that. However, the point here is, here you are in the midst of battle. Sometimes war comes upon you. Talk to your average person in World War II. Did they wake up saying, you know what I'd really love to do? I'd love to go fight Germany or Japan. Or talk to your average German. You know what I'd really like to do? Go on the front lines against Russia, where 4/5 of their casualties happened. Nobody wants to do that, right? I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure you'll find an example. The point here is when you're in the midst of it, you can't get out of it. How many soldiers would have wished that they were not there in the face of battle? Nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. If only we could internalize this phrase. Elsewhere in the Bible it says, will it not be bitter in the end? And so some of you may right now be contemplating an easy way out. Maybe a way to cheat death, maybe a way to get out of your military service, maybe a way to do something to avoid the disastrousness of life, and a shortcut comes up. Maybe I'll do that. To which Solomon says, don't do it. In embarking on this course of wickedness, you are also inviting the consequences of wickedness. Don't do it. That's not wise. And the wickedness will never deliver those who are given over to it. And all this, he comes to in verse 9, I have observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. I looked all around. When man had power over man to his hurt. And it's a forthright recognition that sometimes the government, even the best government, ends up hurting people. Thorns and thistles. And maybe in your own governance, be it in family or employment or whatever forum in which you happen to find yourself, you find the thorns and thistles too. And for all of your good intentions, you end up hurting someone. You didn't mean to. And so Solomon just says, look, I looked around, I looked everywhere, and people end up stumbling and tripping all over each other, sometimes in the most malignant intention, and sometimes with the best of intentions, where man has power over man, and it ends up hurting man. Well, with all of this, I hope some things that we might take away would be living with patience, living with caution, living with integrity, living with wisdom in this rather complicated life in which we live. And may you be wise today.